Okay, so here's our next lesson, the first of two lessons on global impacts on the ocean. The first thing we're going to talk about is ocean warming. Why are the oceans warming? Well, the entire planet is warming due to an increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That traps more heat in the atmosphere, and then that heat just spreads. So the ocean absorbs heat from the atmosphere, and when the atmosphere gets warmer, so does the ocean. So we have graphs approximating the average ocean temperature and how it's deviated from the 20th century average going back all the way to about 1880. And notice that it was cooler in the early, like 1900s, late 1800s. And then as we hit about 1940, you start to see this dramatic increase in global ocean temperature on average. It's coming up on a single degree Celsius, which you may think, oh, that's not that big a deal. But remember, ocean life, aquatic life can be very sensitive to environmental changes, and there can be all sorts of consequences. So, what are some of the effects of ocean warming on marine species? Well, as your temperature starts to increase, that could become above or out of the range of tolerance of a lot of species. That could mean, especially in the warmest water areas, equatorial areas, they could become uninhabitable, which would reduce the habitat for tropical species. As the entire ocean warms, polar species may not be able to find a cold enough habitat, and so polar species may become extinct as well. Then remember the relationship between temperature of a liquid and how much dissolved oxygen or dissolved gases it can hold. As the temperatures go up, that means the dissolved oxygen goes down, and then any species that has high needs for dissolved oxygen would then have lower habitat, especially in the warmest oceans, so equatorial regions or the equators area, tropics, would have more hypoxic conditions and therefore would be less favorable habitats. So, any organisms that can move would have to move to areas with more oxygen. Any organisms, like, say, coral, that are stuck in place would end up potentially dying if they can't meet their oxygen needs. Then, if you keep in mind the fact that a lot of aquatic organisms, basically everything that's not an aquatic mammal, like a whale or a dolphin, are cold blooded, their metabolic rate is going to depend on external temperatures. So, as the temperature increases, their metabolic rate is going to increase, which you may think, oh, that's not a big deal. Maybe they'll move faster. But the thing is, that's going to increase their need for dissolved oxygen in an area that already has lower dissolved oxygen because of the warmer temperatures. So here is a diagram showing kind of some uh, expectations or predictions of what will happen to the swimming of sharks and rays under climate change, especially under ocean warming. And so, what can happen here is you'll see increased metabolic rates, which the consequence would be that there's less energy for activity and less swimming efficiency. There is some hypothesizing that smaller body sizes will become more common with a warmer ocean. In general, a trend tends to be as temperatures increase, body size decreases. But that's a little more on the land. It may not hold as true in the water. I looked at a couple of studies that had some conflicting information. There is a trade off. There could be increased muscle performance because of the higher temperatures, which would let them swim more efficiently. So it's kind of a balance between the positive and the negative aspects of metabolic change. Then there are lots of potential impacts on reproduction. So, in general, as the temperature increases, reproduction is going to be decreased or become less effective. This is because for a lot of species that live in the water, they will release eggs and sperm into the water for what's called external fertilization. And then, because of that, the environmental conditions are going to be very important in helping to trigger when the fish and other aquatic organisms will release their eggs and sperm when they'll have their mating season. And so since they rely on cues like for example, temperature, amongst other things, to control their reproduction. The change in temperature can kind of throw off the timing of their reproduction. So, for example, some fish will use temperature cues to determine when they're going to have their spawning season, which is when they're releasing their sperm and eggs. And because of the warmer temperatures, they may start shifting their spawning seasons later. And that may decrease the total amount of time they have for reproduction, which would decrease birth rate and decrease population sizes. Also, higher temperatures can suppress reproductive hormones and other reproductive signals, thus keeping animals from being able to produce sperm and eggs and therefore reducing reproduction, reducing birth rates, and reducing population. Other species migrate to different locations in the ocean to reproduce, and this is based on temperature cues and other environmental cues. So, if the ocean temperature is increasing, that can either delay migration or it can just cause changes to the timing of migration. That could mean that, sometimes the migration to a different area to reproduce is because there are more resources there or there are less predators there. And if the timing of reproduction changes, then that can impact these kind of potential factors that could influence the success of reproduction. Like if you go to an area and it doesn't have as much food as it should, babies are less likely to survive, and so you'll have an increase in the death rate. If you go to an area that was supposed to be mostly predator free and now there are predators there because it's a slightly different season, then you could end up having an increased death rate as well. And one of the big impacts of ocean warming on aquatic organisms is on coral. So, coral ecosystems, coral reefs are very important spots for biodiversity within the ocean. And coral are actually two organisms living in a mutually symbiotic relationship. There's the animal polyp, and then there's an algae called zooxanthellae, but we're just going to say algae. Those algae live inside the polyp cells and they perform photosynthesis and provide a good 75% of the food for the coral. So they have a very big role in maintaining the health and survival of that coral. But when ocean temperatures rise, those algae start basically having some physical malfunctions that cause some toxic release. So the corals, polyps, spit out or expel those algae. Those algae are no longer within the coral polyps, so all the food that the coral were getting from them, they're not getting anymore. So that makes the coral more sickly, it makes them weaker, it makes them more likely to get sick and die. And unless temperatures cool and polyps allow those algae to return, then you're going to have coral bleaching. Coral bleaching is when coral lose their color because the algae within the coral are what are giving them their color. And so coral bleaching is a sign that coral is very unhealthy. And while some coral can recover from a bleaching event, many die. And there have been many more coral bleaching events, especially in some of the major coral reefs around the world, since we've noticed this climb in ocean temperature. All right, relatively short